Gyfu Gumena bif Gleng and Helenes, Rathu and Wifshipper and Lachna Yuam, all on that wisp if they offer layas.
Oh dear, guess who got caught scrapping in the Mead Hall? Ich eom An-Haga, ich eom wineleas wrecca. That's right folks, I'm in exile. Ich welcome ihr to meinem Wyrdwayz, Wezaf ye hala. Welcome back to part 2 of this Wyrdwayz episode about the Anglo Saxon rune Gyfu. Now in the first part of this episode I was safely contained within the Mead Hall with all the pleasures that life affords. Now, as you can see, I'm very much alone and out in the cold. That's because in today's episode I want to talk to you about the flip side of the Mead Hall life. We're going to be talking about exile. Now before we go any further, let's just remind ourselves of the poem for the Anglo Saxon rune Gyfu. Gyfu Gumena bif Gleng and Helenes, Rathu and Wifshipper and Lachna Yuam, all on that wisp they offer layas. And now in modern English, for those of you whose old English is a little rusty, gift is an honour and grace of men, a support and adornment, and for any exile, mercy and sustenance when he has no other. Okay, so exile was something that ran very deep within the Anglo-Saxon world. Indeed, in later post-conversion times, the Anglo-Saxons would take characters for whom exile had never been mentioned and place them into an exile state. Thus was their fascination and connection with exile. Now, let's go back to the warrior in the Mead Hall. In order for a warrior to become a hero, he needed a context in which that would happen. He needed the hall, he needed the lord, he needed the validation of his comrades. And perhaps the Beowulf poem expresses that extremely well, where it says, I remember the time where we took our mead together, when we made promises to our prince in the beer hall. He gave us these rings that we would pay him back for the war weapons. So you can imagine that for the Anglo-Saxon warrior, the state of exile was particularly abhorrent, because to be without a lord, without a place by the fire, without your comrades, was something which basically stripped them of their own personal identity and who they were. Interestingly, what we do see post-conversion is that the traditional wretched Germanic state of exile is changed and subverted towards the Christian concept of denying oneself earthly pleasures in pursuit of heavenly gains. Now on that subject, I'd just like to mention St. Guthlac. Now he lived in a place called Crowland, eventually, St Guthlac of Crowland, from 673 to 714. So he didn't live very long, which is hardly surprising when you think of how he lived. As a very young man, he was a warlord. He went on raids, he had conquests, he did all of the typical kind of Germanic warrior things. He then became a monk and then later a hermit. Now, he lived out in the Lincolnshire Fens, and he's a saint who is particularly venerated by the people of East Anglia, my homelands, out in the Fens in East Anglia. Now, Felix wrote about him quite shortly after his death, and he tells us that Guthlac made himself a simple cell built into the walls of a plundered barrow, and here he lived. Now, the reason that I wanted to mention Guthlac is that he effectively exiled himself willingly. He placed himself into this liminal, desolate place. He removed himself from the everyday life. He effectively placed himself in his own exile in an attempt to connect with God and to become closer to God. And as we know from Beowulf, these liminal spaces, these were the places where monsters lived. And we know from Beowulf that these monsters sprung up as a result of Cain's exile. So in effect, the Anglo Saxons saw these monstrous folk as being in exile. And I actually find Felix's description of the monsters that shared Guthlac's space with him particularly amusing, so I wanted to read it to you. They were ferocious in appearance, terrible in shape, with great heads, long necks, thin faces, yellow complexions, filthy beards, shaggy ears, wild foreheads, fierce eyes, foul mouths, horses' teeth, throats vomiting flames, twisted jaws, thick lips, strident voices, singed hair, fat cheeks, pigeon breasts, scabby thighs, this is hilarious, knotty knees, crooked legs, swollen ankles, splay feet, spreading mouths, raucous cries. For they grew so terrible to hear with their mighty shriekings that they filled almost the whole intervening space between heaven and earth with their discordant bellows. Now, one might assume that Felix was perhaps slightly exaggerating there, but to be fair, I'm not 100% convinced there aren't a few things like that still kicking around the fens to this day. I'm allowed to say that because I come from there. So as I said, Guthlac placed himself willingly with these horrendous, scabby creatures out in the fens of Lincolnshire, in an attempt to become more holy and pious. Now, interestingly, the Scandinavian, the Norse tradition practice of utaseta, sitting out, this was effectively the Northern Europe version of the vision quest, where people would take themselves away from the inhabited safe spaces and out into the wild places, because there it would be easier to connect with the spirits and the deities and seek wisdom. So you could look at it that this idea of these wild spaces being better to connect with the divine, it's originally a pagan concept which went through and continued into Christian times. And I mean, it's obvious really, isn't it? If I want to try and connect with the gods, I feel that I've got a much better chance of doing it somewhere wild like I am now than if I was in the middle of a city. So it kind of makes perfect sense. So let's now go back to the heathen Germanic peoples and their concept of exile. So before we look at exile by looking at some of the poems that have been left to us, let's have a look at exactly why exile happened. Now, as I said in the first part of this episode, peace or thrift was something which they attempted to create and maintain through gifting of treasures and weapons. However, sometimes the gifts were not treasures and weapons, they were brides. Now, women in Anglo Saxon society were often expected to act within the role of peace weaver, whereas men were often expected to take up axe and blade. Women, particularly high-born women, were sometimes expected to marry their family's enemies as an attempt to form peaceful alliances between previously warring families. Now, I know which I would rather do. I'll take the axe any day of the week. Where was I before I started playing with my axe? So within the Beowulf poem, we are told about successful peace weavers and unsuccessful peace weavers, those women who could form peaceful alliances between warring families and those that just couldn't. Beowulf does tend to categorise women into three groups: good peace weavers, bad peace weavers, and monsters, which probably says more about attitudes towards women at the time than the actual women themselves. So the successful peace weavers that Beowulf tells us about is Wealhtheow, who was Hrothgar's queen, the queen of the Danes, and we also hear about Hygd, who was Hygelac's queen, the queen of the Geats. Now, both of these women within the poem are seen in roles of being hostess at the feasts within the Mead Hall, and they're also seen as being advisors to their husbands, the lord or the king. Now, in the unsuccessful camp, the women that Beowulf tells us were not very good at being peace weavers, we hear about Freyja, who was Hrothgar's daughter, and we also hear about Hildebert. Now, Hildebert, we hear about her in a story which is told to Beowulf after he has defeated Grendel in the Mead Hall, and in this story, which actually comes from the Finnsburg fragment I have mentioned before in a previous episode, we hear the tragic story of how Hildebert loses her son, her brother, and ultimately her husband, who is Finn, the king of the Frisians. Basically, things kick off when her brother, a Dane, comes to visit her with her Frisian husband and their son, which result in most of her family being killed, and ultimately her returning across the sea back to her Danish father. And as for Freyja, in fact, she has not actually even married her father's enemy's son at that point. But her failure is basically prophesied by good old Beowulf, who thinks that her charms will not be sufficient to prevent hatred and war between her family and the family that she's marrying into. Ultimately, a peace weaver's success depended very much upon the menfolk's ability not to kill each other. So we can see that the Anglo Saxons had various mechanisms in place involving gifting, whether that be weapons, treasures or women, in order to maintain peace. But exile, we can look upon exile as a deterrent, as a threat for anybody who stepped outside of the prescribed laws within the walls of the Mead Hall, because nobody would want to be cast out on their own away from their community, away from their ties. A warrior in particular would not want to lose his connection with his lord. He would not want to lose his place by the fire, his comrades, everything that he had fought and struggled to create. He would not want to be cast out into the desolate places, a man without an identity, left to wander in his own misery until his death ultimately came. So exile was something which existed in Anglo-Saxon society as a deterrent against breaking the rules. Exile within Anglo-Saxon poetry shows diverse characters in very similar situations, and the Anglo-Saxons had set conventions for expressing the state of exile. Now, effectively, the Anglo-Saxon singer who wanted to tell his audience about somebody in exile would focus on 4 different aspects of this state: status, deprivation, state of mind, and the movement in or into exile. Now, if we look at status, we can basically see that the Anglo-Saxons use one of 2 key phrases to describe somebody in exile, and it's quite likely to an Anglo-Saxon audience that these phrases would have conjured up all sorts of images that they were familiar with. So we have wineleas wrecca, which basically means friendless wretch. Now the word wrecca basically translates as one driven from his country, wanderer in foreign lands, an exile, stranger, pilgrim. And you've only got to look on the Bosworth Toller online dictionary to see how many times this word is used within the Anglo-Saxon texts that we have left to us, to see what an important concept it was for the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the other phrase which they use a lot in poetry is An-Haga, which basically means solitary one. If we look within Anglo-Saxon texts, we can find other phrases such as Wyrdwayz, who is a stranger who seeks protection in the land from which he has come. So it's a concept which is well covered within Anglo-Saxon texts. So what I want to do now is to have a look at a few poems about exile, just so we can see how the Anglo-Saxons describe this state. Now, all of these, they're all known as elegies, and they all come from the Exeter book. So really, you know, the Smiths have nothing on the Anglo-Saxons. Morrissey may have said, "Heaven knows I'm miserable now," but trust me, these Anglo-Saxons had the whole misery thing well wrapped up before the Smiths emerged from Manchester. And thinking about it, as a former teenage goth, maybe this is just one of the reasons that I am so into these Anglo-Saxon guys. I don't know. But so the 4 poems that I want to look at today are The Wanderer, The Seafarer, The Wife's Lament, and lastly, last but not least, Wolf and Eadwacer. Now, some people, you know, the way that this poem is interpreted varies a lot between people. There's a lot of contention as to what it actually means, but I think that it may be showing us a state of exile and showing us the perspective of the person who is left behind as a result of that exiled state. So let's start with The Wanderer, shall we? Now, the story of The Wanderer, it tells us it's written from the perspective of a lone warrior who has lost everything. He is the only survivor from a battle where his lord was killed, all of his comrades were killed. He was the only one to survive, and as a result, he has lost everything. Everything that he held dear to him, everything which basically gave him his identity, has all been stripped away, has all been lost. Now, as we know from Tacitus, it was considered a great shame to leave the battlefield if your lord, your king had fallen. Cowardice, and I'm not saying the warrior showed cowardice, but just on that subject, cowardice was something which was very looked down upon in the Anglo-Saxon warrior culture. Indeed, we have such phrases used, such kennings used in Beowulf as battle dodgers and tail turners when referring to people who were too scared to fight. And indeed, it was something that happened. You know, a warrior's bravery could falter, but it was something very shameful in their society, and quite possibly something that could get you exiled. So obviously that was not the case for this warrior, but he was the only one left alive at the result of the battle. And indeed, in the poem, he says, "In the Mead Hall I might find kind folk who knew my kinsman, or would at least console me, a friendless man, or entertain me for a time with merry songs and happy tales. Many know that sorrow is cruel company when loved ones are lost." Now that's a translation by Edward Moore. Thank you, Edward, for a very enchanting translation of that poem. Now, as we know, the Anglo-Saxons believed in weird, and actually a previous episode I did actually quote from the Wanderer and also the Seafarer, and quotes concerning weird. That was in my episode. And in this poem, the character, he seems to accept his fate, to accept it. He also displays the stoicism that we so associate with Anglo-Saxons, and indeed that's a quality which has endured and which is still very prevalent within the English people. Now, really this poem is a blend of both Anglo-Saxon and Christian elements. I like to think of it as an originally heathen poem which has had a kind of Christian veneer placed over it. That's how I see it. Others may not. So I picked out a few parts of this poem that I would like to share with you. "The wretched way of the wandering one holds no well-spun gold, only a begrimed ghost, who cannot receive the earth's sweet bounty. Battle halls he recalls, where gifts were given, how in youth his lord led him to the feast, that glory is gone." So this, this very much gives the flavour of these exile elegies. And another section I picked out. "How with his hands he would grasp the knees of his lord and bow humbly his head before the glorious gift seat, but alas, he awakes, friendless one, and sees only barren waves and bathing seabirds preening their feathers, falling snow, frost, hail." Now, part of this poem was actually of great influence to Tolkien when he wrote The Lord of the Rings. Now, I'm going to read you part of Tolkien's writings now from that book, The Lord of the Rings, and you may recognise it. I think it's very beautiful. "Where now the horse and the rider? Where is the horn that was blowing? Where is the helm and the hauberk, and the bright hair flowing? Where is the hand on the harp string, and the red fire glowing? Where is the spring and the harvest, and the tall corn growing? They have passed like rain on a mountain, like a wind in the meadow. The days have gone down in the west, behind the hills into shadow. Who shall gather the smoke of the dead wood burning, or behold the flowing years from the sea returning? Now this part of Tolkien's poem is based upon the part of the Wanderer where really the character asked himself questions that his head already knows the answer to, but his heart is unwilling to accept. These questions are asked as a result of emotional longing for the situation he had previously before everything went wrong. Let's hear that now, shall we?
Hwe quam meg, hwe quam mago, hwe quam mathu yifa, hwe quam simble yesetu, hwe sindun selad lemas, ele biot bune, ele bien wiga, ele theodnos frim, hu seo flag yewat, yenaf under nithelm, swa heo newala.
Okay, so I'm now going to move on to the next poem that I want to look at, and this is the Seafarer. This is in a very similar vein to the Wanderer. It's again written from the perspective of a lone warrior who has been exiled, and it expresses his pain and his sorrow at his condition. Now he's been exiled on the sea, where he tells us he has spent a cold winter. Now the Anglo Saxons had a very special connection with the sea, a very special draw and connection with it, which I'm sure we will talk about in another episode. So I'm going to read you a section now from the Seafarer. This the man does not know, for whom on land it turns out most favourably. How I, wretched and sorrowful, on the ice-cold sea, dwelt for a winter in the paths of exile, bereft of friendly kinsmen, hung about with icicles, hail flew in showers. There I heard nothing but the roaring sea, the ice-cold waves. At times the swan's song, I took myself a pleasure, the gannet's noise, and the voice of the curlew, instead of the laughter of men, the singing gull, instead of the drinking of mead. Storms there beat the stony cliffs, where the tern spoke, icy feathered. Always the eagle cried at it, dewy feathered. No cheerful kinsman can comfort the poor soul. So you will notice there the similarities between this poem and The Wanderer. Now let's move on to something rather different, shall we? So now I want to talk to you about the third poem I've picked out, which is The Wife's Lament. Now this one's different because, well, it's written by a woman, something which is rather unusual in Anglo Saxon poetry. Because basically it was a man's world. For sure, women had more rights in Anglo-Saxon times than they had post-Norman conquest, but you could hardly call them liberated women. Now the theme of this poem is one of separation and longing. It's a poem which expresses the intensity of her grief, her longing and her desire, and her loneliness. The poem, obviously a lament, it tells a tale of a woman who's been sent into exile by her husband. We don't know why. We don't know why this formerly loving husband has sent his wife into exile. We can only speculate. Her husband's family didn't support her and plotted against her to keep her separated from her lord. And it tells us that her husband exiled her off to live under an oak tree. Whether this was literal or metaphorical, we don't know. It's more than possible that a contemporary audience would have understood some of this imagery and interpreted it in a different way than us modern folk would. But what we do know, what is apparent, is that she was utterly miserable and living in great despair and longing for her former situation with her husband. Now she describes herself in the typical Anglo Saxon way of describing exile as a wineleas, wrecca, friendless exile. But what is interesting is that at the end of the poem she appears to change her tune, and while through the bulk of the poem she is basically expressing her longing to be with her Lord, at the end she appears to wish a similar or worse fate upon this man, that man who has sent her into this state of miserable exile. And we hear her use such words towards him such as "Yea o mormod," which is sad in spirit, and "Blessed o cherla," which means sorrow in the breast. And we hear her use the line "That mit freon sitef under staan liefer storma berlimed wiener welimod watrla befloen ondleosella," which translates as something like that my lover sits under a stony cliff, frost covered, my lord weary in heart, surrounded by flowing water in a dreary hall. So this seems to me a bit of Anglo-Saxon feminist angst. At least I certainly hope that is the case. So lastly but not least, I would like to move on to the poem Wolf and Eadwacer. Now, as I said, although this poem isn't typically interpreted as an exile poem, I like to think that it could show the condition of the person who has been left behind because her lover has been exiled. Like the wife's lament, it shows longing and desire, the pain of being separated from the person that you love. And what I'm going to do first is read it to you in modern English. And again, this translation is by Edward Moore. My people are watching him, waiting to slaughter him for a sacrifice if he comes too close to the clan. We are estranged. Wolf is on one isle, I on another. Like a fortress is that fen-wrapped island. Slaughter cruel men, swarm that island, waiting to slaughter him for a sacrifice, should he come too close to the clan. We are estranged. With wild hope my thoughts dogged my wolf. During rainy weather I sat wailing, disconsolate, until battle-strong arms embraced me, bringing both pleasure and pain. How I pine for you, my wolf. Desire has made me sick. It is our meetings I miss, not meals. Do you hear, Eadwacer? Our wretched whelp is dragged to the woods by a wolf. That one tears apart what was never whole, the tale of the two of us together. So now we shall hear it and see it in Old English. Now, those of you that follow my videos will know that I have already posted this one as a separate video just for this poem, because I love this poem. And on that one I subtitled it in modern English. So what I'll do with this version is that I'll subtitle it in Old English, because I know some of you like to see the Old English text as I read it. So enjoy.
Leadum is minam, swilche him on lark Gyfa, willaf hi huna asajan, Gyf hi on flet kumef, Unyelich is us. Wolf is on ear, each on offala, fast is that eland, fenne be warpen. Sinden wal lewe, well as they are on ear. Willaf hi huna athajan, yifion flirt kumeth. Unyelicha is us. Wolf is each meanes weed lastum, wenum dogada. Thonne hit was fleni weda on each flirtigusat. Thonne match se budu kafa, bogen beleda. Was me win to thon, was me wafa each love. Wolf mean wolf, wena me thina. Seoch ye didon, thina seld kimas. Mun in de mod, nalas metalista. Je heerless thou Eadwacer, unkerne emna whelp, belef wolf to wooda. That mon eia tos listef, that a nafla ye somed was, unker yeador.
Okay, I'm getting quite cold now. So before I conclude this episode, let's just go back to the Old English rune poem for this one again, shall we? Gift is an honour and grace of men, a support and adornment, and for any exile, mercy and sustenance when he has no other. Now this poem tells us that mercy and sustenance would be provided for any exile when he has no other. Now, as I have said before, and as I'm sure I will say again many times, roots run deep. Now, we've spoken about exile and the utter misery and disconnect that brings for whoever is in that condition. But this poem tells us that support and sustenance would be provided for that exile. And indeed, in the Wanderer poem, we hear that he is hopeful that he will find a Mead Hall where he will receive kindness. Now, this tradition of welcoming strangers into your home was very important to the Anglo Saxons because it was an age-old European tradition. Now, sadly, in this day and age, it's something which we have lost in this very selfish, insular society that we now find ourselves in. Certainly in the UK, I cannot speak for other countries, but people have in general, become very insular and very cut off from these very ancient Indo-European traditions that had been going on for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. Now, if we turn back to Tacitus, as I am wont to do, who wrote in AD 98 about the Germanic tribes on the continent, he tells us some very interesting facts that I would like to share with you now. No nation indulges more freely in feasting and entertaining than the German. It is accounted a sin to turn any man away from your door. The host welcomes his guest with the best meal that his means allow. When he has finished entertaining him, the host undertakes a fresh roll. He accompanies the guest to the nearest house where further hospitality can be had. It makes no difference that they come uninvited. They are welcomed just as warmly. No distinction is ever made between acquaintance and stranger as far as the right to hospitality is concerned. As the guest takes his leave, it is customary to let him have anything he asks for, and the host, with as little hesitation, will ask for a gift in return. They take delight in presents, but they expect no repayment for giving them and feel no obligation in receiving them. So that is very interesting. Again, Tacitus comes up with a gem. So we can see that from what he said, strangers simply would not be turned away from the door. It was a sin. Now, the concept of not turning a stranger away from your door is, as I've said, deeply Indo-European, and we can see it in other cultures that have the same roots, such as in Greece. Now, it could be born out of the fact that the gods were sometimes known to change their appearance and walk abroad amongst humans. Indeed, Woden, Odin, has done this several times, as documented in the sagas. And let's face it, absolutely the last thing you would want to do would be to turn Woden away. So perhaps, it's born out of people never quite knowing who that stranger was that turned up at their door. It could have been a god. And the last thing you would want to do would be to offend a god. So next time a stranger turns up on your doorstep in need of help, and thinking about this did actually happen to me a 2 or 3 months ago, and I'm pleased to say I did help. You really should think twice about who that person is, because it could be a deity in disguise. It could be Woden, it could be Futhorc, it could be Free, it could be a god in disguise come to test you out. So think about that next time you are in that position. So I am thoroughly cold now. It's funny to think that just a couple of weeks ago, or even a week ago, I was gardening in a t-shirt, and now it is frizz, as we say in East Anglia. We actually say something else which is a bit rude, so I won't say it on YouTube. Anyway, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. I've been so busy rambling, I haven't thanked my subscribers. Thank you to my subscribers. I do really, really appreciate your support. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment. I love to hear your comments. And if you haven't already subscribed, it would be great if you could do so. I would appreciate that muchly. If you want to support the work that I'm doing, you can buy me a coffee, and the link will be below. I also have a Patreon where you can support my work from just £3 a month, and again, that is very much appreciated. But for now, I need to say goodbye, go and find somewhere warmer I can be. Now, I clearly have quite a lot to say about this rune poem, because there's actually going to be a part 3 as well. So I will see you again for that one shortly. The sun appears to have come out. The clouds have cleared and the blue skies above. Anyway, thank you for watching. Thank you, and I will see you again next time. Okay then. Ayla.